Thank you for joining us today on the Real Biblical Application podcast. Today, I have a special guest with us, Kaleb Leonard from Huntington, West Virginia. And he's come on the podcast today to talk about a verse that is probably one of the most misused verses today in our society, which is Matthew chapter 7 and verse 1, where it says, "Judge not, lest you be judged." Kaleb, how about you take some time to tell our listeners who you are and a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on the podcast today. I'm really excited for the discussion today. Like Stuart said, my name's Kaleb Leonard. I've worshiped here with the congregation in Huntington, West Virginia my whole life. I grew up here, was raised here, and just a few months ago, I got to meet Stuart and kind of hang out with him for a short period of time. We got to know each other a little bit better, and now we have studies, I think once a week at least, where we get to talk a little bit more about the Bible, and I always enjoy those times that we get to talk. Like Stuart said, I've worshiped here for a while, and just a few months ago, I think it was 3 months ago now, I was ordained as an evangelist here in Huntington, and I've been working with the church, kind of thrown in the deep end, I guess, with the work here. But it's been really rewarding for me. It's been really satisfying to work with the church here and to host a lot of Bible studies with people out in the community and kind of get to learn more about the people here and get to help the church in any way that I can. So it's been really exciting.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. And you're a full-time student right now as well, on top of all that, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Lord willing, I'll graduate with my degree in chemistry at the end of April, so about a month away now.
Well, that's exciting, getting your education, and then you'll have a lot more time, I guess. Or are you going
Yeah,
to continue on and do more school after graduating?
yeah, I think that I'll continue on with a graduate degree after I graduate, but I'll at least have a summer off probably, so get to do a lot more work during that time.
Well, very good. Let's dive into this verse a little bit, or maybe the context, or maybe how this verse is used in our society. We most often hear this whenever we're trying to study with someone, and maybe we are talking about issues that they may be having, maybe some sin in their life, or maybe we're talking to a brother or sister in Christ, and we're having discussions about the Bible, and a point comes up that's a point of contention or maybe a point of correction, and they quote this verse and they say, "Judge not, lest you be judged." What are some of the ways that you've heard this verse used?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I've heard people talk about this verse, different preachers and family members and people that I respect, my whole life. I've heard different interpretations of this verse, and I've heard about different ways that people might use this verse. But it wasn't really until I started the work here and I began to really study with a lot of people that I had never met before that I really started to understand what these men and women were telling me in the past. I think that there are really two main ways that people use this verse and really interpret this verse and apply it as well. The first way that I've noticed in my studies that people and even some scholars like to apply this verse is what I like to call the absolute interpretation. And this just means that it is absolutely inappropriate, rather, to ever judge anyone or anyone's actions or motives or anything of that sort. And the application there would be that and would lead to a sort of moral relativism or cultural subjectivism where nothing can be said to be right or wrong. It's all depending on your own heart and your own circumstances, and therefore you shouldn't judge me for what I do. And then the other option that I think is probably the second most appealing to most people is a more cautionary interpretation where Jesus is not saying necessarily never to judge anyone or anything, but rather he's saying be very cautious in the way that you judge people, because the same kind of judgment that you deal out to other people will be dealt to you by God. And so we ought to be very careful about that. I think those are the two main ways that I've heard this passage used in the past.
So this absolute interpretation, I would say that this is probably the most common that I hear from people in our society. And you were right in that if someone takes on this interpretation, we literally have no grounds biblically to point out any issues or to help someone with any issues that they're going through. So if someone has, been sinning with alcoholism or something like that, and we try to point out scripture to help them, they could simply invoke the Matthew 7:1 verse and say, "Judge not, lest you be judged," and end that conversation completely. And that really takes away our ability or authority, I would say, to evangelize anyone and tell them about the truth, because telling someone about the truth involves correction and showing them that the way that a Christian should live their life. And so you were right that in that absolute interpretation creates chaos.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a underlying problem with that interpretation, like we've talked about already, with the relativity that it creates, with nothing being absolutely right or nothing being absolutely wrong, but everything's relative to you and to your situation and to your heart. And that can be a difficult thing to overcome. There are even very academic and educated men who argue for this sort of thing, not necessarily from Matthew 7 and verse 1, that might be adjacent to it, but really they argue for this sort of thing using other more sophisticated arguments. And so there are different ways to hear this statement come across, whether it be from someone who just simply quotes it, or maybe one who's a little bit more educated and tries to give some other supporting evidence for it. But nonetheless, I think you're right. I think that this creates a very chaotic way to study the Bible and to try to come to terms with someone.
Whenever I was preparing for this specific podcast, I was looking at verses in the Bible, or trying to think of verses in the Bible is more accurate. And Psalm 14:1 says, "There is no God." And someone could just pluck that verse out and say, "There is no God," and totally take away anything that the Bible is teaching us, saying, there is no God, so nothing matters. But right before that, it says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." And so we have to be careful about context, and that we're not just plucking a verse right out of thin air, right out of the text, and not looking at the context. And that's why I've been assigning these verses to men like yourself, because there are so many verses in the Bible that people take out of context and misuse, and they don't handle the Word of God appropriately. So what is the context here?
So this is Jesus speaking, and maybe that's one reason why people like to quote it, because Jesus is seen as this very authoritative figure. And so if he says something, then we ought to listen to it as much as we can. And I agree with that. But we should also take into consideration the context of this statement. So Jesus has walked up to the top of this mountain. That's in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 1. And when he gets there, he starts on this kind of long sermon that most people call the Sermon on the Mount. And lots of different people have tried to analyze exactly what Jesus is trying to do with this sermon. Obviously, when I give a sermon, or when someone else gives a sermon, every sermon has a purpose behind it. We're trying to accomplish something with it. And lots of people are trying to consider, what is Jesus's purpose with this sermon? And I think that one of the best suggestions to that question, an answer to that question, is that Jesus is giving a constitution almost of the kingdom of heaven, or of the new covenant with his people. And when we are in America right now, and we have a Constitution of the United States that the founding fathers wrote and all signed into law. And we use that as kind of the foundation to build other laws upon. And so I think maybe Jesus' sermon here is working in a similar fashion. In fact, if you look through this whole sermon, which spans Matthew 5, 6, and 7, you find lots of very foundational principles. Like in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 3, when Jesus first begins the sermon, he has these very general principles. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted, and so on. And so I think that it's good to realize that these are foundational principles, first of all. In fact, maybe this whole sermon is filled with lots of foundational principles that could use some more elaboration sometimes, and Jesus oftentimes gives us more elaboration later in his ministry. So Matthew 5 begins with those Beatitudes, or blessed are the ... fill in the blank. And then it continues with more foundational principles, beginning in verse 13 of that same chapter, with you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? You are the light of the world, a city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. These are all passages I think many people are probably familiar with, because they've become almost common sayings in today's language. But then he goes on in chapter 5 with some more things, some more foundational principles. He talks about the contrasts between the old law and the old covenant with his new covenant. Then he moves on in chapter 6 and gives some more context to this statement we're going to talk about, when he gives and shows his disciples how to pray with that model prayer, when he says, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, and so on and so forth. Then furthermore, he continues in the rest of Matthew 6 and talks about some more, again, foundational principles, things like treasures. We should have treasures for ourselves in heaven and not on earth, and more things like that. And I think we should notice, lastly here, that the nature of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount starts out very basic, like we said, and kind of becomes cumulative in nature, where he's slowly building up more and more and more. And then finally, towards the end of the sermon, which we won't necessarily talk about all that much today, he starts to get into some really difficult teachings about the kingdom of heaven and who is going to enter the kingdom of heaven. And so I think that context all becomes super important when we talk about this verse in particular.
So before we get too far, and maybe I'm taking us off track a little bit because this isn't your topic that I assigned to you, but several times there you said kingdom of heaven. You said it's the constitution of the kingdom. You said entrance into the kingdom of heaven. So what is the kingdom of heaven, if you're prepared to answer that?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question that lots of people have tried to answer over the years, and there are lots of different answers that people have given to it. Some people say that the kingdom of heaven is just heaven itself and nothing more than that. And some people add more to it. I think that the kingdom of heaven here on earth, and I think that this is supported by Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 16, constitutes those who are his children, those who are part of his congregation. The psalmist says that God has a great congregation, and I think that great congregation in this new covenant is called the church, and I think that is a representative of God's kingdom here on earth. There may be more things included in God's kingdom besides just those things that we could talk about, but I think that's the short of it. I think that's the short and simple answer, that here on earth, if we want to be a part of God's kingdom, and want to enjoy the benefits of God's kingdom, then we have to be a part of his church.
Okay. Thank you for taking time to answer that. Again, I didn't assign you that, but I appreciate you having a ready answer. And that kind of just saying that just now kind of made me think of another verse that maybe flies in the face of judge not lest you be judged, is Matthew, or no, sorry, not Matthew, 2 Timothy 4, verse 2, preach the word, be ready in season, out of season, which is what you just were. You were ready in season and out of season. But the reason we are ready in season and out of season is so we can reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching, which is something that would not be possible at all if we could not judge anyone. We couldn't, there'd be no reason to be ready in season and out of season to reprove or rebuke or exhort.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and I actually plan to talk about this a little bit later on in this discussion, about what Timothy is told here by Paul, about convincing and rebuking and exhorting. And then verse 3 continues, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but will, according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from the truth." And so the fact that there is such a thing called the truth, must mean that there is also something that is false, and we have to be able to judge between those two things. So we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in a little bit later.
How would you interpret this verse then in the context of the Sermon on the Mount? Um, Matthew 7, verse 1. What's your interpretation of that?
Yeah, so there are lots of different ways that people have translated this verse. I think that's probably the first thing to notice as we walk through the interpretation of the verse itself. The most familiar one probably is in the King James Version and New King James Version. That's something like, "Judge not that you be not judged." I know that there's other versions that say something to the effect of, "Do not judge so that you won't be judged." But no matter which way you slice it, it's kind of the same idea. It's conveyed in all the different translations. Um, and also, we mentioned this earlier, I think. Notice how simple the verse is. There's no words in there that are super difficult, really. There's no language that's used that we're not used to. We all know what it means to judge, and I think that it's something that's very simple. And yet, like I said, there's so many different ways to interpret, and really so many different ways to apply this verse, I think. So that's something to notice as well as we kind of dive in here. But I think the one of the most important questions that will be asked here is, what kind of judgment is Jesus talking about? Because if you think about it, there's all different kinds of judgment that we could that could be meant here. There's civil judgment. This is the one we're probably pretty familiar with here in America, where people are accused of a crime and they go before a jury and a judge, and the judge has to do just that. He has to judge this person and this person's actions. The jury also has to kind of weigh in and discuss whether or not they think this person committed this crime or whatever. You see this kind of judgment talked about in Romans 13 and in Titus 3 and verse 1. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that Jesus could be talking about this kind of judgment. He could be talking about civil judgment here. But again, we want to consider the context, most especially when we try to pick out what Jesus is actually saying. And if you notice, there's nothing about judges or juries, or there's nothing about the Roman imperial system where Jesus lived. There's nothing about kings and rulers here. So that doesn't seem to fit the context of this verse. So what are some other options for the kind of judgment that Jesus may be talking about? Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and 2 Thessalonians 3 and John's epistles especially, you see some talk of church discipline, where church members are to judge the kinds of sins that other members may be involved in, and there could be a need for discipline in those situations. But again, if we look at the context, that doesn't seem to be what he's talking about. We don't see anything. The church hasn't even been established at this point in time. That wouldn't happen until Acts chapter 2. So again, we don't see any reason to read that particular interpretation into this verse either. So I think that there's probably two more ways. The first way that we could interpret this is that he's talking about false teaching. In 1 Corinthians 12 and chapter 14 as well, and also in 2 Peter 2, we see a lot of teaching about, from Paul and from Peter both, about how to judge teaching and to see whether or not it's right or wrong, or to see whether or not we should follow it or reject it. Peter says in 2 Peter 2 that there would be people who would come along and would try to deceive the church, would try to deceive good and honest people with their false teaching. So it could be that Jesus is talking about this kind of judgment, judging doctrine and judging false teachers. But again, we don't see any mention of false teachers here, really. We don't see any mention of that in the context. So once again, I don't think we should read that interpretation into this verse either. So the last option, and what I think is probably the best option here, is hypocritical judgment. You know, when you see someone performing a certain action, and you know in the back of your mind that you've done that exact same thing yourself, maybe even very recently, and you condemn them for doing it, but don't condemn yourself or don't see a need for you to change yourself. This is a form of hypocritical judgment. And this kind of judgment we do see actually in the context. Most people don't read on past verse 1, judge not that you be not judged. And you even mentioned that most people don't read past that first phrase, judge not or do not judge. But actually, verse 2 gives us a really important sentence here that helps us to understand verse 1. Verse 2 says, "For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you." That's, I think, really, really important. That's kind of almost taking that first statement in verse 1 and just explaining it and making it simpler. You see the same words are being used over and over again that were used in verse 1, just kind of in a simpler way almost, and in a more explained way. Then also in verse 3, you see there at the beginning, it says, "And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye?" So again, we see there at the beginning of verse 3, this kind of connecting word, and he says, "Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye?" So this is a person who sees a problem with their brother. That's the figurative way that he's saying it, is that there's a speck in your brother's eye. So he sees a problem with his brother, but he does not consider the fact that he has an even bigger problem in his life, or maybe the same problem in his life. Verse 4 continues, "Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me remove the speck from your eye,' and look, a plank is in your own eye?" And then Jesus gives the conclusion to the whole matter. In fact, in most Bibles, you'll see that verses 1 through 5 are kind of a little paragraph there. He says in verse 5, "Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." So Jesus starts out by saying, "Judge not, that you be not judged." But by the time he explains all of it, he gets to the statement, "Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye." So first, before we go off and judge other people, we have to, and try to remove the speck from their eye, we have to make sure that we are in a good standing first and that we don't have a plank in our own eye. Otherwise, we'll be guilty of what verse 1 says, that we shouldn't judge, so that we might not be judged with the same measure, with the same hypocritical form of judgment.
He pretty much tells us which view is correct there, doesn't he? Because he says hypocrite. So the hypocritical view is pretty straightforward, I think. He tells us. But if there's one thing Christians are accused of, it's being hypocritical, pointing the finger at others and pointing out the issues they have in their life, and then not realizing that they have the same issues, or maybe that they have other issues, and maybe they need to approach that conversation with a little bit more humility and not self-righteousness, that look how holy I am because I do A, B, C, and D. And, I'm looking at this speck that you have in your eye and I am condemning you for it. And if there's one thing that Christians aren't to do, it's to condemn people. That's not our purpose here on this earth. We aren't the judge. That's the point. We're not the judge, and so we can't condemn anyone. And so that self-righteous attitude of pointing out everyone else's flaws when we have our own set of issues is something that I think is pun intended, being condemned here.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That's something that I think everyone has to work on from time to time, um, of cultivating an attitude of humility when we talk to other Christians or when we talk to people maybe who aren't Christians yet, but we would like them to be. It's very easy to, condemn someone else for doing something, and yet behind their back or kind of off in private, we do the same thing. So we have to be really careful about that. Something else that I think goes right along with what you just said is what Jesus himself says in Luke chapter 6. Luke 6 is kind of a similar place to Matthew chapter 7, a similar parallel to Matthew chapter 7. Jesus is kind of giving this same sermon in just a slightly different way, kind of rewording some things and maybe helping us to understand a little bit better. And in Luke 6, I think it's in verse 37, he says, "Judge not, and you shall not be judged." But then this time he doesn't explain it in the exact same way as he did in Matthew 7. Instead, this time he continues and says, "Condemn not, and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven." So you see that exactly what you just said is being displayed by Jesus's words here. You've almost got this parallelism where he says, "Judge not, condemn not. And if you judge not, then you will not be judged. And if you condemn not, then you will not be condemned." I think that really helps support what you just said.
I like the flip side of that coin too. He says, "Condemn not, and you shall not be condemned." And he says, "Judge not, for this. If you judge, you will be judged in the same manner, or the same way." Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." So the flip side of being judgmental or condemning people or having that self-righteous attitude is actually to be merciful and to be gracious, because we've been given mercy and grace. And so I like looking at that flip side too, instead of just looking at what we aren't supposed to do. What are we supposed to do? We're supposed to show mercy to others whenever we approach, especially whenever we approach someone's possible sin in their life, realizing that we are sinners and we've been shown mercy, and so we should show it to others.
Yeah, I think that's right. Something that's very similar to that is the illustration that Jesus would give later on in his ministry. And obviously, Jesus was God in the flesh. That's what John 1 tells us. But even he had this attitude of humility. And you see in Matthew, the end of the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus uses this fig tree as an example of judgment on Israel. And you see Jesus talking to his disciples about this fig tree that bears no fruit. It looks like on the outside that it is healthy and that it's springtime maybe and everything's budding and there should be fruit on it. But when he gets closer, you see that he sees that there's no fruit on it, and he curses that fig tree because of that. And so you see that Jesus isn't condoning a hypocritical judgment. He's not condoning the fact that a person like me or you could walk up to someone and pass some hypocritical judgment. In fact, that's what this verse, like we said, is condemning. But instead, he's advocating that we know someone first, and that we are carefully considering the situation and the circumstances before we pass any judgment on anyone for any reason.
So what percentage would you say is of this verse, can you say is based on action versus attitude? What I mean by that is Jesus condoning hypocrisy, or is he, not condoning, condemning hypocrisy, or is he condemning hypocrisy with a self-righteous attitude?
I think that this verse is kind of condemning the second of those two options, but I think overall he condemns, I think throughout his ministry, he condemns both. So I think no matter which answer we give right here at the end of the day, we come away with a conception from Jesus that both are wrong. We first of all shouldn't be a hypocrite, but second of all, and perhaps even worse, if we are a hypocrite, then we shouldn't try to pass hypocritical judgment as well. That would be even worse than just being a hypocrite ourselves. So I think that's kind of the final takeaway, although maybe in this verse, the latter of those two options is kind of more in view here.
I was just thinking of, like Alcoholics Anonymous. All these people are struggling with alcoholism and maybe fall into trials and succumb to temptations involving alcohol. And for someone who is an alcoholic to try to help another alcoholic, we might say, well, that's hypocritical. Well, it's not the hypocrisy in the sense. It's not the fact that you are a sinner trying to help another sinner. It's that it's wrong to have a bad attitude and act like, you're perfect and you're just trying to condemn others or point out everyone else's flaws. So in that sense, it's more of an attitude than an action, I would say. Doing it with the right attitude may be fine, but doing it with the wrong attitude is certainly wrong.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that we see lots of examples of things like this in probably everyday life. We talked about at the very beginning of this discussion about if we take the absolute interpretation of this verse, that it's always wrong to judge someone, no matter what, and we come away with this relativism or relativity situation where you can never tell if anything is right or anything is wrong. But I think after going through this verse and seeing what we've seen about the context and about the proper interpretation of it, I think we see that Jesus is actually saying the opposite. There are some things that are objectively wrong, and it's not necessarily our duty to be hypocritical about it and to pass hypocritical judgment. But as people who care about souls and who care about making it to heaven and who care about other people, as Christians, we ought to do our very best with the most humble attitude to help others in any way that we can. And I think that's what Jesus is probably getting at. And we see that's the attitude Jesus had too.
Certainly. Galatians 6:1 says, if you see a brother in a transgression, you restore that brother. And that's an encouragement that is necessary in the Christian's life, to sometimes to look at someone's life and look at an issue they're having or a trial they're going through, and to help them through it and correct or rebuke. All these might be necessary in our Christian life. And so if we want to restore our brother, we might have to rebuke him, but we have to do it in a loving way. And so again, it comes back to the attitude that we have in doing that. What is your motivation? Why are you doing it? And I think that's important.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You see that attitude with Jesus again in Philippians 2. You see that attitude where Paul says about Jesus in verse 8 that he had been found in appearance as a man, and he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Therefore God has also highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of those in heaven and on earth and those under the earth, that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. So you see, Jesus had this attitude of he wasn't in it for himself. He wasn't in it for his own glory necessarily, but he loved his creation. He loved his people, and he wanted to see them in eternity with him. And so he humbled himself to the point of even being willing to die for mankind. And Paul also says that in verse 5 that mind that was in Jesus should be in us too, that whatever we can do to help others and whatever we can do to glorify God ought to be at the forefront of our mind at all times.
I want to talk about the second part of these verses, and we already read it, where Jesus is talking about the plank and the speck. And maybe this is kind of a humorous illustration here to imagine a 2x4 sticking out of someone's eye, and trying to, that person trying to get a speck out of someone else's eye. The idea of a plank in someone's eye, what is that referring to? Does that mean it's the same issue? Is that what it's referring to? So in other words, just going back to the alcohol illustration, because we've used it several times now. The plank is obviously a bigger issue. Is the bigger issue a worse dependence on alcohol than the other person? Is he a greater alcoholic trying to fix a lesser alcoholic? Or is it, again, something like an attitude that's the bigger problem in this person's life? Do you have any idea, or is there anything to even take from that other than you have issues and you're trying to help other people, or trying to correct everyone else's issues?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I heard a preacher one time, I think it was the preacher anyway. He said, well, in both instances, you have this, something is in their eye and they need it out. So both people have something wrong in their lives. We know at least that much. But the question that you've asked is a good one, and that is the log representing something worse or something different, or is it the exact same problem, maybe just intensified with from the log to the speck, or the beam to the speck, or whatever illustration you want to use? And I think really the problem comes back to a hypocritical attitude. If a person has a log or a plank or a beam or whatever in their own eye, and they go to their brother and they see a speck, it would of course be hypocritical for them to point out the speck, something that seems very small and insignificant in their brother's eye, when they themselves have something very, very large in their own eye. So I think that the point he's getting at is that it could be the same problem. If we're going to the example that we've used before of alcoholism, it could be that both brothers in this case have a problem with alcoholism or with addiction or whatever it may be. But and it could be that one is worse than the other. But I think that the reason the one is referred to as a log or a plank or whatever, and the other one is referred to as speck, is that the one who has the log or the plank not only has the problem of alcoholism and addiction or whatever it may be, but he also has the problem of hypocritical attitude as well. And so he has kind of a twofold problem that is kind of turning his own speck into a larger problem that really it may have been to begin with.
So verse 5, Jesus calls this type of person a hypocrite. And he says, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Is that telling us that removing the plank is just getting rid of that hypocritical attitude? In other words, the big issue is not that there's something in your eye, it's that you have a hypocritical attitude, and that's a bigger issue. Is that what that's saying?
I think that there's a little bit of that, but I think it's not limited to that. I think that obviously the log, or even if you only had a speck in your own eye, let's say that you have a speck in your eye and there's a speck in your brother's eye, and you try to help him get his out. When you have a speck in your own eye, even if we leveled the playing field, so to speak, there's still a problem with you, even if you don't necessarily have the hypocritical attitude. If both parties, to use the example we've used, are alcoholics or have a problem with alcohol addiction, and neither one of them are hypocritical, they're both genuinely trying to help the other, or maybe one is trying to help the other. It doesn't change the fact that there's still a problem in both brothers or in both people, even if the hypocritical attitude is removed. So it could be, I think, that hypocritical and hypocrite attitude is in view here, but I think it's not just limited to that. I think there's also a precedent for examining the speck in your own eye and making sure that you try to get problems out of your own life as well. You're not, eventually, we won't give account for what someone else does. We'll give account for what we do in this life. And so if we have problems in our own life, we ought to try to get those out as fast as possible.
I say that because, you know, this verse is an interesting one about removing the plank from your own eye. Because what someone could draw from that is that I need to make myself perfect before I try to correct anyone. That I need to make sure that I'm out of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've been clean for 10 years before I ever try to help anyone with alcoholism or something of that sort. Maybe this is kind of where the judge not quoters kind of get their theology from, is the absolute, interpretation is that, first you have to make yourself perfect before you judge anyone, and you're unable to do that. You'll never be perfect. And so I think verse 5 is a pretty interesting verse for that.
I think that it's a really interesting analogy that Jesus uses here. It's one that we're not really used to using analogies like this in our modern society. But nonetheless, I think that what you said is right. I think that it's difficult to know. Obviously, we don't want to be hypocritical, but at the same time, I think the Bible teaches that we'll also never be perfect. We're never going to get to a state of perfection, at least in this life. And so it's difficult to know, to find that balance in life. But nonetheless, I think that Jesus gives us precedent here for not being hypocritical. And then in other places, he helps us to see how to better judge situations with a more humble attitude.
Right. And it's important to note for anyone that's listening that the Bible does not contradict itself. In other words, you can't find one place in the Bible where it says the sky is red, and then another verse that says the sky is blue, and another one that says the sky is green. It's not going to happen that way. We have to find ways. How do these verses harmonize together with other verses that I see in the Bible, such as, 2 Timothy 4 or Galatians 6:1, or, other verses that talk about ways that we need to correct our brethren or evangelize the world or whatever it may be. We have to find ways to harmonize Scripture because it doesn't contradict itself.
Yeah, that's right. I know that we've talked about this already, but there are, of course, places in the Bible that talk about the Scriptures being used to exhort, rebuke even at times, and convince other people of truths and of propositions about God. And also there are Scriptures, like you mentioned, even in Galatians and in other places as well, talk about proper methods of judgment. And so if we are holding to that idea that the Scripture does not contradict itself, and there's two clear passages, and one says to judge in this way, and another one says do not judge so that you won't be judged, then we have to ask ourselves, what is the best way to harmonize these? And I think that we don't have to do too much digging in this situation in particular, because in Matthew 7 and verse 1 and the continuing verses, I think that Jesus does the legwork for us. He explains what he means for us. We don't have to search too far to find out exactly what the harmony is between those two verses.
So what are some of the applications we can take away from all this? It's real biblical application, so we have to talk about application. What would be some ways that we could apply this verse appropriately and biblically?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We don't want to, leave and stop this conversation when we talk about application. It's kind of the whole purpose of the podcast. So obviously, I think that there's a big step to take between interpreting a passage and applying a passage. Obviously, there are all kinds of people in the world who can read the Bible and analyze it and understand it and interpret it and know exactly what it says. Maybe they're scholars of one kind or another. They can know exactly what the Bible says. but they don't have any interest in applying what the Bible says to their own lives. They don't have any interest in letting the Bible change their lives. So obviously, application can be a big step sometimes, but I think using the groundwork that we've laid so far of a proper interpretation of these verses, I think the application becomes a lot clearer. And I think, just 3 applications that I've written down that I take away from this verse, and maybe you have some more to share, and we can talk about those. The first one is that we ought to not abstain from all judgment. There is a certain kind of judgment. In fact, Jesus gives us a kind of judgment that would be okay. He says in verse 5, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you can help take the speck out of your brother's eye. So there is a time and a place to help your brother with the speck in his eye, but it only comes after taking the log out of your own eye. And that's so that's the first application, is that there is a time and place for judgment. And the second application is very similar to it and kind of adjacent to it. And that is that we ought to be careful and cautious about the kind of judgment that we give. We ought to make sure that it's proper judgment and that it's the kind the Bible would approve of, that Jesus would approve of, that God would approve of. We ought to not judge with hypocritical judgment, or else Jesus says that we'll be judged in the same manner. And of course, if we're judged with this hypocritical judgment or this super intense scrutiny, then we're going to be found as sinners, of course. I know that Romans 3 and talks a lot about that, about how all men are found guilty as sinners before God and have fallen short of his glory. So if we are judged with this super intense judgment and scrutiny and for being hypocritical, then of course we're going to be found sinners. So we have to be very careful that we don't judge people hypocritically like that. And then the third application that maybe is a little bit more abstract and a little bit less practical is that this passage is not condoning, it's not approving of some sort of relativism. It's not saying that you don't know other people's situations, so never ever judge someone else. Never say to someone else that they are misapplying something, or that they're not understanding something, or that they're sinning in some way, because that would be judgment that's inappropriate. I don't think that's what this verse is saying at all, and I think that we've discussed that already. So I think that that's what Jesus says here.
Yeah, those are very good. And like we've said over and over, our attitude needs to be right whenever we are approaching people. And this is something that I have been guilty of many, many times in my life. And I would say only until fairly recently has that attitude changed, where I've looked at my life and I've said, as long as I do these things, as long as I'm tithing my mint, dill, and cumin, to use a biblical term, as long as I'm doing these things, I'm good, and God's proud of me because of these things that I'm doing. And then I've looked at others who are not tithing their mint, dill, and cumin, and I've said, well, that person is lost. That person's not saved. They worship a little bit different than I do. And maybe the way they're worshiping is unscriptural. And I say, you know what? Because they're not worshiping right, they're not saved. I've had that attitude in my life many times. What I think is, in those moments, I have had a plank in my eye. I've had a plank in my eye, and I'm saying, look, you're doing this wrong, and because of it, you're not saved. When I am being self-righteous, and that's a plank in my eye. Or I'm not showing mercy. That's a plank in my eye. I'm not loving God with all my heart, soul, and mind. That's a plank in my eye. And here I am pointing out this discrepancy in their life and trying to condemn them. And I don't think God calls us to have that kind of attitude. Surely, I mean, sure, we're supposed to correct that. If we see error in someone's life, we can approach them and correct it. Tons of verses in the Bible show us that. But if we have a hypocritical or a a self-righteous attitude, then we are approaching every one of those conversations with a plank in our eye. And we are going to be shown the same judgment that we show others. And we're going to be given mercy for the times that we're merciful. And I think that is a very important takeaway from all this.
Yeah, I would agree completely with what you said. There have been times in my life I've done the exact same thing. I can remember times when I've looked at other people who weren't doing things, whether it was in one way or another, quite like I do them, or quite like I think they should be done, or even quite like the Bible says they should be done. And I've, kind of passed some judgment on them because I thought that I was, higher than them or above them or better than them in some way. And like looking back on it, I had, for every one thing they had wrong, I had 10 more things that were wrong in my own life, whether it be, morally or things that I had said or done in my past that just were unresolved. And of course, that kind of judgment is exactly what he's talking about here. The fact that I would be willing to look at someone else and see a tiny problem, what might seem as a very small problem, and try to point it out when I have 10 of my own problems to deal with that are much bigger and much more important than pointing out their small inconsistency.
Avoiding or ignoring a sin in someone's life is wrong of us too. We shouldn't say, well, because I have issues, because I have all these issues in my life, then I cannot point out someone else's issues. I don't think that's correct either. If there's one thing the Bible teaches us is that we're imperfect. And yet the Bible still calls on us to correct others. But we have to be in the process of correcting ourselves also. Otherwise, we're being hypocritical. If we don't have the attitude that I'm trying to follow Christ and I'm trying to submit myself to Jesus in my life, then how can we point out areas in other people's life where they have shortcomings? That is the plank. That's the issue. And so I appreciate everything that you've said, and I think this conversation has been helpful to me, and I hope it's helpful to others too.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I appreciate this conversation too. It's been really helpful to me. I think that a good rule to live by is if you're going to talk to someone about a problem that maybe you perceive in their life and you want to help them through it, then you should always be aware and that if they brought up a problem in your life, that you would have a humble attitude, that I would have a humble attitude about it. Because if I want them to have a humble attitude when I approach them about maybe a problem that I perceive or something that I want to help them with, then I should be willing to do the same if they approach me about a problem that they see in my life. So I think that's probably a good takeaway, a good way to live.
How do you think, again, this is not your topic, but I think it's a good question. What's some good practical ways to cultivate a humility in these conversations whenever we are going to correct a brother or sister, or maybe someone we're trying to evangelize or convert someone? How do we cultivate the right attitude in those situations?
That's a good question. I think as you were asking that question, I had two thoughts that came to mind, and maybe they're the same thought, just stated slightly differently. But the first thought that I had is that when I try to approach someone, maybe who has a problem, maybe who has a problem that I used to have, or maybe that I still have, I need to remember what it was like to be in that situation. I need to remember how was it that I was helped by someone else when I was in this same situation. If I had this problem with whatever it may be, with whatever sin it may be, how did I get through it? And how did I get from where I was to where I am now? How did I do that? And was there someone in my life who was super helpful in that? Was there someone in my life who was who kind of took me by the hand or kind of put me under their wing and kind of took me through and pushed me through that problem? If that's the case, then how can I do the same for another person? And the other thought that came to mind as to how to practically cultivate this kind of attitude is to read the Gospels. Yeah, Jesus was a person who helped a lot of people through difficult situations, um, and he had people who tried to help him through some of his difficult situations, and sometimes it went well, sometimes it didn't go so well. But Jesus, it seems, was a master of helping people through these difficult situations. And so maybe if you're going to try to help somebody through a sin that they have in their life, or help them work through a problem maybe that they have with someone else, then read the Gospels. And even if you read a portion of the Gospels that doesn't necessarily deal with the same problem that you're dealing with, I can almost guarantee that Jesus will have some kind of wisdom and some sort of attitude that we can imitate and try to apply to our lives when we try to help other people.
Very good. I think that's a good place to kind of wrap it up. I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate your studies and your words of wisdom. And hopefully we can get you another topic soon enough and get you on again.
Yeah, I'd be all for it. Thanks for having me, and hope that I'll talk to you again soon.